Hello and welcome to another episode of 1000 Actually Fun Books, where we are on a quest to find the best of fun escapist books. And today we're reviewing a non-fiction book. It's called The Spy and the Traitor by Ben Macintyre. So this is a book about Cold War espionage. It is a fascinating look into behind the scenes, specifically about one of the most famous spies that turned traitor in our favor during the Cold War. So a man named oh man, am I going to pronounce his name right? Olav Gordevsky. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Oleg Gordevsky. Okay, so he was originally Russian. He was, or Soviet, really, because this is the Soviet Union at this time. His father was a KGB operative, his older brother was a KGB operative, and he became a KGB operative. And he decided he really did not like Soviet Russia. Ideologically, he just thought it was oppressive and ugly and cruel, and he was exposed to democracy, one of the few people that was able to get out from behind the Iron Curtain as a Russian spy. And so going to Finland and I think it was mostly Finland area, and then eventually into other places, he was exposed to Western culture, and he was just astonished and romanced by it. He just loved it. He loved the music, he loved the books, he loved the freedom, he loved the food, he just loved the culture, and because of that, he decided to turn on the Soviets. And it was an ideological thing, not for money, which is what most spies turn traitor for. They tend to betray their country for financial gain or through blackmail. Usually it's not ideological causes. So, but he did. Oleg chose to go to the British and basically say, hey, I am part of the KGB. I can tell you some secrets. And they were like, oh, sure, tell away. And so he became one of the highest level KGB operatives in the Soviet Union during the 70s, 80s era, and that was telling the British secrets, the way things were organized, and the way the KGB was thinking, the paranoia, the corruption, and obviously, who were spies and who was not. Just all sorts of secrets behind the scenes. So this is a book that really gives you all the James Bond stuff. You've got, copying microfilm, and you've got people smuggled in suitcases in the trunks of cars, and you've got rendezvous that you have to lose a tail, and you've got drops that are secret, messages, put an orange peel under a bench to indicate you have something to give me, and I'll put a file under, the phone booth at such and such a place, or whatever it was. And so it has everything that you kind of want from a Cold War spy story, except it's all true. So it's pretty fascinating book. So if you like history, specifically, more modern history, and you like espionage, then this would be a book for you. The writing was pretty darn engaging. It wasn't quite narrative. It definitely has, exposition, a more, not quite textbook. It's much more narrative than I would have expected for a lot of books like this, that it is strictly nonfiction. But it has a lot of detail that's really interesting. A lot of historical details there. That's definitely a positive. You learn a lot from, again, techniques that the spy world uses to how certain spies were caught or not, and the goings on behind the curtain in the Soviet Union during that era. And that's really interesting. I really liked what they did for the history lessons there. The historical details were very interesting. The author did a good job making this engaging, although it was not quite wholly narrative. And I will do a excerpt towards the end here, kind of showing how that is not quite narrative. It's not quite a historical fiction in the feel, but the author still does a really good job of making you feel, you could get lost in the story for good chunks of it as you are wandering through, feeling that tension of, is he going to get caught? Is somebody going to notice? How is he going to get out of this situation? Things like that. That does make for a very engaging story. The pacing is pretty good too. The author intersperses, a lot of I will say action, although that isn't quite the way it's going on, more like tension and drama with more laid back stories. It does switching from what's going on with Oleg to something like a spy that gets caught, a chapter dealing with what was up with this other guy that was also turning traitor, but on the other direction. Like, for example, some American CIA spies. I think it's Amos was one of the, I could be mispronouncing his name too, but what was up with him? Because he actually was the reason Oleg was eventually exposed and how that all turns out. So it kind of delves into a chapter of what's up with Amos's situation. Why does he turn traitor? What about some other people that tried, like there's a spy, a person in Britain who really, really, really wanted to be a spy for the KGB. And he kept attempting to contact the KGB, and the KGB kept thinking it's a trap, and so ignoring him. And so he was eventually caught by the British and tried for treason. And it's just kind of a funny little excerpt of somebody who was a failed traitor. But you have things like that going on. So it's not completely about Oleg, but it is mostly about Oleg because he has his fingers in a whole bunch of different pies as far as the espionage world goes at that time. Maybe he had a hint here to tell about that, or maybe afterwards he could tell what the reaction was on the KGB side. You have going on politically. So you have Margaret Thatcher and Gorbachev meeting. And Oleg was a huge part behind the scenes to try and make those two pieces fit together. Okay, Gorbachev, here are some talking points you want to think about to bring up with Margaret Thatcher. And Margaret Thatcher, here are some talking points you want to bring up with Gorbachev. Here, I will give both sides tips so that they got along better. Just things like that that's really kind of fascinating to read about. And it makes for a really interesting story. It's not, the chapters don't end on cliffhangers or anything, usually, but it still makes you want to find out what's happening next because he had such an interesting life. The characters, for the most part, the main characters were interesting. I wouldn't necessarily always say likable. I will say our main character, Oleg, he has some admirable qualities. So, for example, him turning to the West and saying, I want to be part of this, not the Soviet communist bloc, it feels admirable because he seems to be doing it for, again, admirable reasons, as opposed to, like I said, most of the spies of the time, blackmail, money, not much in the way to be admired there on why you would betray your country. But he seems to do it because he wanted to see the Soviet Union be better. There were times where he was hopeful that the Soviet Union would have reforms and come and become a better country. It wasn't that he hated his country. He just didn't like the direction that the leadership was taking it. He saw the corruption and the evil that was happening, the oppression, and wanted that part to change. And so you kind of admire him at that. He was not, however, wholly admirable. For example, at the very end, and this is historical, so it's not really spoilers, but he does flee the Soviet Union and make it to Britain. It was a very fascinating escape. Like, by the skin of his teeth did he make it. And almost got caught multiple times, and lots of errors, and lots of poor judgment, and yet he still managed to escape. But anyway, he left his wife and 2 young children behind. And his thought on that was kind of like, well, I've kind of felt out my wife, and if I say anything, she will betray me. She is not willing to defect. and so he leaves them behind. But because he did that, as you can imagine, in Soviet Russia, they're not going to be treated super well being the wife and family of a traitor. So, she spent basically 6 months being interrogated. It doesn't sound like violently, not tortured, but constantly being questioned and constantly in prisons and, for hours and hours and days on end. And her children had to have their names changed to prevent them from being harassed, and just endless problems that he made for his family. And you think about that and go, that is not an admirable quality. He was thinking about saving his skin. He was not really thinking about his family. And I don't think that was an admirable trait. Mostly, he seems like a decent person who tried his best and tried to make the right decisions. And you respect him for that, but not all the time. So it was a very real person, just like any other real person. They did a good job with all the volume of names and acronyms. The author did a fairly decent job because you have person after person after person in so many different areas on both sides of the political divide in multiple countries, and so it's kind of like who is doing what and why. But the author did a pretty good job. He will bring up some people that, you forgot about him several chapters ago, and occasionally he doesn't explain it well enough that you immediately pick up on who this person is, and then you're like, oh yeah, that was that spy back in Denmark or Finland or somewhere that was that they had mentioned exposing a while ago, and now it's 10 years later and they're finally deciding to do something about it. That kind of thing. You're like, oh yeah, that's who that guy was. So the author does a decent job of that. Usually, there's not too many times where you're like, who is that guy again? And usually when that happens, it's not an important character anyway. You don't really care. Same thing with acronyms. Obviously, there's a whole vocabulary, the technical speak that goes with being a spy, from all the acronyms that were given to things to hide them from the other side. Olag was originally, I think, Sunbeam, and then he was something else, and then he was something else for paperwork purposes. And so again, the author does a decent job of keeping you up to date on who it was, what did this mean. They're occasionally sprinkled in foreign words like Russian words and stuff, and usually they're defined well enough that you don't have any problem following. So the author does a good job of that. There is occasional humor in the book, and sometimes that has to deal with the spying techniques that people are using. Sometimes it's dealing with the stupidity of people, like his incompetent boss and totally missing the signs of somebody wanting to defect, things like that. Here's an example. They had, Olag was supposed to meet with a potential informant, because he is nominally supposed to be KGB, right? He's supposed to be collecting people in London or around in the British Isles to be informants for the KGB. So he's trying to find people. And one person he contacts with is said he had such a strong Scottish accent, and Olag's English wasn't that good, so he only caught, occasional word. So there's no evidence then on whether this Scottish guy, was he ever trying to defect, or was he just talking about football? He had no idea. So things like that, it's just a little bit of humor there going in. Not a huge amount, but enough to, occasionally make you smile. Okay, one more thing that I'll say on the positive note. This one is kind of, okay as far as positive goes, but I will say it's mostly positive. And that is, the author is very highly patriotic, Western-centric. This is the West is good, the communists are pretty much wholly evil, bad. There's nothing good about Soviet Russia. And so it depicts everything in light of that. You do not get a sense of balance there of, well, there are some things good about the KGB, or they did some positive things. It's pretty much all wholly negative, and everything is depicted in light of that. Olag's defection is wholly good. There really isn't any negative about that. And then people who defect from the West toward the KGB are wholly horrible. And And that may be true. I mean, I'm good with that depiction, but it didn't always feel super balanced about that. So this one I don't consider a negative, but somebody else might. So be aware of that. Okay, so on the downside, I'll just say the only real downside is some of the, lack of narrative moments. And I want to give you an example here. So I'm reading on page 77, and we have Guscott. So he is going to be a British spy, and he is working with Oleg to try and pull something off here. Guscott rushed to a nearby safe house, locked himself in an upstairs bedroom, and took from his backpack a pair of silk gloves and a small flat box, 6 inches long by 3 inches wide, roughly the size of a pocket diary. He drew the curtains, turned off the light, unwound the microfilm strip, inserted one end into the little box, and pulled it through. It was quite a sweaty palm procedure, fiddling in the dark. I always knew that if I couldn't do the operation in time, I'd have to abort, and if I damaged the microfilm, it was a real problem. So what you have here, you notice, is you had a paragraph that felt basically like a novel. He's rushing to the room, he pulls the curtains, he starts doing the microfilm, and then it switches point of view. It's a first-person quote, in quotation marks, of what he was reporting after this fact as he is being interviewed, talking about this experience. So you have 2 kind of different ways that the author is writing this. Some of it is this almost adventure novel, historical fiction type of feel to it, but it's interjected with a bunch of quotes and recollections and reflections of somebody afterwards, and he quotes whoever it is that's saying it, this is how I felt, and looking back, this is what I thought, and, in retrospect, that kind of thing. So it doesn't flow perfectly because of that. But it's obviously a benefit if you want the historical accuracy. I will read one more paragraph, just on the next page, 78, and this is kind of give you an idea of some of the adventure quality going on. Despite every precaution, there was no accounting for mistakes. On one occasion, Guscott arranged to make a brush contact at a railway station north of the city. He placed himself by a window in the station cafe, drank a coffee while waiting for Gorvetsky to appear and leave a roll of microfilm under a ledge in a nearby telephone kiosk. The Russian duly appeared, made the drop, and walked away. But before Guscott could get to the kiosk, a man stepped into it ahead of him and began making a telephone call. A long telephone call. The minutes slipped past. As the man obliviously chattered on, inserting one coin after another, there was only a 30-minute window in which to pick up the film, copy it, and return it to a second contact site in another location, and it was closing fast. Guscott loitered outside the telephone box, hopping from foot to foot, exhibiting an anxiety that was not feigned. The man in the telephone ignored him. Guscott was on the point of barging in and grabbing the roll when the man finally hung up. Guscott reached the second brush contact site with less than a minute to spare. So that's kind of an example of the, interesting stories that are in this. There's a lot of little things like that. That's just one paragraph of one instant of a real-life spy encounter. And that's kind of interesting. It's kind of fun. So overall, I give this 2 thumbs up. I am very positive about this book for a nonfiction book. If you would like to read more about Soviet spying, then I would encourage you to read this book. Okay, part 2. So my second book is going to be called Fortunately the Milk. It's a children's book by Neil Gaiman. He is a pretty famous author. He's done lots of things, but I'm going to do this as a kid's book. So I have already read it. It's really short, and it was really good. So I'm going to do a review of that next time. I hope you join me. Thank you for watching.